The Department of Homeland Security employs 250,000 people. They have a lot of sub-agencies underneath them. One of those sub-agencies is FEMA. And now there's talks of making FEMA disappear. What would happen if it were destroyed? How would it impact you? Let's get into it. So, what's the problem with FEMA? The president has been criticizing it since day one when he was in North Carolina touring the mess the hurricane made. He said, FEMA's a disappointment. Too slow, too bureaucratic, cost a ton. He's got a point. FEMA does cost a lot of money. They have a budget of about $33 billion, 20,000 federal workers. The president's fix? Get rid of that agency, give the power and responsibility to the states. And the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, she recently said, we're eliminating FEMA. No exact details on how she plans on doing this, but they're cutting wasteful spending to allow states to lead. And the president recently doubled down on this concept. On March 19th, he had an executive order pushed out on national resilience strategy. More state power, less FEMA. But here's a catch. The president can't completely destroy or get rid of FEMA. He can reorganize it. He can change its mission, but he can't completely dissolve it. Without Congress. Legislation needs to go through Congress in order to completely eliminate this agency and any other agency. Now, Congress proposed the FEMA Independence Act. This is different than completely getting rid of it. What it does is it rips it away from DHS and it makes it more independent so that it's less bureaucratic. So it's able to respond and to become a little bit more agile. The public perception of FEMA has been down. According to a recent Gallup poll, only 49% of Americans think they've been doing a good job. FEMA was created by President Carter in 1979. But ever since 2002, they've been under the Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security really just formed right after 9/11. And it was to go ahead and to ensure we had domestic security, mainly to prevent further terrorism. And they shoved like 20 different sub-agencies underneath the umbrella of Department of Homeland Security. Last month, FEMA fired 200 probationary workers. But some of those workers were probably reinstated by a federal judge's ruling that happened not too long ago. And one of the issues we're seeing at agencies really is people are complaining about increased workloads. And then you have all these probationary workers that were reinstated, but a lot of them are on admin leave. So they can't even rejoin the team to help out with the workload. They're just on standby status. Now with FEMA, there's a lot of reports saying that they have a hiring freeze. They're not hiring anybody. I jumped on usajobs.gov. I found one position. This one opened up in March. It's a detail position. This is only for 45 to 60 day deployment, and then you go back to your previous agency. Only current federal employees can apply for a position like this, but I'm surprised they had anything opened on USA Jobs. So what would happen with no FEMA? States would have to come up with the money and the people, and it would be a little bit different because instead of one plan, you would have 50 plans. You have 50 governors, you would have 50 plans. Let's take FEMA's budget of $33 billion, split it 50 ways. That would be $660 million for each state. Then the question becomes, is the federal government giving the states that money, or will the states have to figure out how to get that money? Because if they have to figure out how to get it, that's a huge amount. $500 million for each state? You know what a state would have to do to find that money? They would have to raise taxes. That's the only way they're coming up with money like that. That's a significant amount. And if the money is somehow being given to the states, then how are you going to decide which state to give it to? Because you have a state like California, they're having a disaster almost every week. Almost every weekend you hear something happening in California. And then you take a state like Delaware. Delaware has had like 10 disasters in the last 20 years. So based on the state, the population, the frequency of disasters, is there like a mathematical formula that would have to go into it before the states get that money? You would also probably see other agencies taking on some of that responsibility that FEMA once had. So take the Department of Defense. You could easily see specifically the National Guard. They could be involved in stuff like search and rescue operations, logistics and aid delivery, and infrastructure repair. The National Guard also reports to the state's governor, so that could fall right in line with the administration's plan of giving the control to the states. Now, we've seen the National Guard react to Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey. I was even helping the National Guard out about 15 years ago on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. There was a huge storm that hit. Trees were all over the place. They were blocking the highway. They were blocking a lot of the roads. They came out there with chainsaws and they were just cutting the trees so that the cars could go through. The National Guard could be a really good solution. And then for medical emergencies, you would look at an agency like perhaps HHS, the Health and Human Services. They would have to jump in. Now, if FEMA were to go away, some of the main challenges would include coordination between the states. This could be for a lot of reasons: political differences, legal framework, priorities, resources. All of these could be issues. Let's say the state of California is having wildfire issues. They're looking for resources. They're asking Arizona. They're asking Nevada. But Nevada doesn't have that much money, and they want to preserve it in case something happens to their state. Same thing with Arizona. Did we get to a point where Arizona and Nevada refuse California, saying we're not going to give you anything? Even though we're neighbors, we're not giving you anything. Then you have the lack of federal standards and oversight. States would create their own standards. FEMA has one standard. Now, they have their best practices. They would probably disseminate that out. But ultimately, it would probably be up to the state to create their standard. Then we have slower response to national emergencies. This comes down to centralization. Right now, FEMA is the one-stop shop. They coordinate with FEMA. If you're doing it with 3-4 states that have been impacted, that's a lot more coordination that goes into it. That's a lot more room for things to potentially go wrong. Then you have resource imbalance. This comes down to how the states would be funded in order to establish their own mini FEMA within that state. How are they going to recruit? How are they going to retain? What are they going to pay? What is the money that they have for the resources that they need to fight disasters? Is it going to be taxed? And if it is going to be taxed, look at California. They already have high taxes. But my goodness, they would probably need the most resources out of any state. They would probably need the most in order to deal with the wildfires, with the earthquakes, and everything else they have going on over there. But for a lot of people, there are some positives of getting rid of FEMA. And that includes removing the dependency on federal aid, saving money in the federal budget, and states are closer to the communities and understand the needs of their people. Whatever the future holds, two things remain true to me. Number one, you're going to see the resources and the staffing of FEMA reduce over the next few years with the Trump administration. The second thing is it takes Congress to get rid of any agency. So you can't write an executive order. You can't snap your fingers and make it go away. It requires legislation. So that's something that we could see in the future. Now, with this administration, I would say that anytime you take presidential action, or let's say drastic action, the more drastic the action, the more severe the correction is. So if you're going through your administration and you're removing, let's say 5, 10, 15, 20 agencies. So what happens when there's a Democratic president? What happens when there's more of a moderate Republican? Let's say somebody closer to the center. What will happen is we might see a president come in a few years, and they might write 100 plus executive orders and completely unwind everything that you've done. So I think it's important to ask yourself, when you're making these actions, to say, is this extreme? Is this something that most Americans will agree with? Or is this something that's kind of far out there? Because if it's something that most people would agree with, it's probably going to stay. It will probably survive you, meaning that you are gone, you pass away, but your impact remains because it's something everyone can get behind. I know that's kind of a radical idea to just suggest that we can all get behind something, but I think there is a danger with radical political actions. Is eliminating multiple federal agencies radical? To some people, it is. FEMA isn't the only agency that's been shooken up recently. You have another agency that have announced recently they're cutting everyone's salary by 25%. Just take a quarter of the salary and make it disappear. It's going to save them a lot of money, but many employees in that agency, they don't want to work there anymore. Big surprise, right? If you want to know more about that, check this video out next. Stay updated by signing up to the free newsletter down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.